Hey guys, I wanted to take a look at my latest painting. This is the painting that I used for demonstrating my smudge brushes and how I developed them and what I decided to smudge. But this is the painting process before I smudged at the final bits when I fully put it together, and you'll see at the end when I started smudging. But I did use a reference. Of course, the reference is from a low camera, a worm's eye view camera, and I really wanted to experiment with the tilt and the 3/4 view. And I really loved the shadows on her face. They weren't too long and they weren't too empty or stale. They had a lot of texture to them. What I'm doing right now is just blocking in the major landmarks, I call them, figuring out the contrast I wanted to keep. I did start this painting knowing that the far side of the 3/4 view, I wanted to decrease an accent and keep the accent for the closest side to us and focus on the edge work. I was looking forward to using the edge on the nose on the other half of the face, which I was going to blend thoroughly. In this stage, I did bring in contrast pretty early, as you can see, and I blocked in some of the highlights I wanted to use because the photograph had it and the photograph kind of invited me to it. But I never really do this anywhere else. I don't really bring in that block of contrast. So I always have midtone and shadows and degrees of shadows and degrees of midtone. But I never really bring in that final little highlight so early. So this was a little bit different. I just wanted to explore some of that sheen that she had in her makeup, and she's wearing a lot of makeup around her eyes, layers and layers of it, if you can tell, and I wanted to see if I can get away with that a little bit. I didn't like it because I was going to bring in texture from the brushes and then bring in the texture and then bring in the contrast, and texture and contrast, as you know, texture meaning the fine detail. That's just two ways of bringing in detail, and I didn't want to overwhelm the piece. So that contrast is the final stage. That's what one of the final stages of detail that I try to avoid until the very end, and that's pretty much what I wanted to avoid the entire time. And exploring it, I made a mistake. And I eventually dulled it down when I started blending later on. You'll see when I start smudging and I was demonstrating the brushes, I really started to smudge away at the edges and bring down the contrast. And detailing and contrast are two ways to create detail. Detailing meaning fine detail. And the best way to create detail without having to depend on contrast is edge work, as you know. So there is that, the fact that I was still going for my initial mission statement that I always go for every painting, which is edge work is always prioritized. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, how so much not an option it is. It's not an option to avoid edges. It's not, you don't just walk in one day and say, I don't want any more edges in my work. There's always a degree of edge work needed to keep your work anchored into being familiar, to be some kind of familiar subject, some kind of subject that is recognizable. So there's that. There's the fact that I was trying to keep the edge work prioritized, and this is pretty much the early stages before I started blending it away. I didn't consider it a success piece because it looked so plastic, and I used soft brush a little bit too much, and I was looking too polished. It looked a little bit I don't know, it looked like some kind of I don't know, I don't like to use the word amateur, but it looked pretty amateur to me. It looked like something that I would paint a long time ago, and I didn't like that. I didn't like that I was incapable of pulling off that texture, something that I would do painterly. So, of course, you know me, I'm always promoting the smudging and then the equivalent of traditional into digital, and how to preserve traditional techniques and how to allow them help us guide our brush along some sort of anchored and grounded technique that's completes our work faster at a higher efficiency. So basically meaning, that sounds like a bunch of jargon, but it basically means minimizing layers and working in blocks and then moving into lighter or sharper shades, smaller subjects, and then working in lighter shades or midtones, then moving into lighter or darker, because as you know, in traditional, once you use black, you can't really undo that. You can't really have to paint it away. So that's what I'm always talking about. And smudging is one of those techniques that we preserve, that we transfer from traditional. And I just didn't like how plastic it looked. I was moving away from traditional. I wasn't thinking about it properly. I was so caught up trying to capture the anatomy and the perfection. And I was also streaming and talking to my viewers a little bit, so that might have distracted me as well. So a lot of stuff went into why I didn't consider this a successful piece early on. I did capture all the dark spots as I should have. I captured the tilt of the nose properly without having to measure. So that was a nice little like little I guess signature for me to know that I'm improving, that I didn't have to over measure, which I usually do when it comes, or usually did before. About a year ago, I used to always measure, and then I would just end up measuring too much and not be in love with the painting, and not have, I didn't jump into the process as fast as I should have and got into the paint of it. And I like to get my hands dirty with painting. I like to go in and start sculpting with the paint. And I felt like I would have delayed it if I did measure, so I just went in and measured, and it turned out great. Measurement wise, that the lips are a little bit off, as you can tell. The lips are leaning towards the right, and I had to correct that later. And that's something that you will make a mistake with if you don't measure. But all in all, other than that issue, the measurement was fine. It's just this little specific issue with that whole plastic look. You can really tell that it's happening now. I just didn't like it. But yeah, that's a little tip I wanted to show you guys, bringing in the cast shadow once you're done sculpting the form. So I don't bring in cast shadows in the middle of the painting process, because I feel like they're accessories and they're just going to get in the way of major blocks that I'm going to bring in. Cast shadows are surface accessories, I refer to them, and I try to avoid using them too much in the early painting process. But later on, you definitely have to bring them in. They're vital. But yeah, this is pretty much my process for this painting, and a lot of the mistakes that were made early on. So remember that in the early stages of the painting are where you're going to make the major choices, and those are going to be the major choices that are either going to be a mistake or a success. And a lot of success was made with the measurement. This is me adjusting the mouth, and a lot of mistakes were made as well, and it wasn't an ideal thing. There was no point when I would have said, there's no point in the future, I feel, where I would have said, oh, this is the right amount of contrast. It just doesn't look right to me. It looks cheap, it looks cheesy, it looks oily. Even though in the photograph there is contrast, I just didn't like how it felt, and I wanted to bring it down. And but yeah, those are my major issues that I have with this painting. Now that I look at it after like a couple weeks, I do see a lot of problems. Some of those I've corrected already with my edit for the smudge brush demonstration for this the smudge brushes. But other than that, I feel like I haven't really explored much into other areas that I could have fixed. I did work on the far side a little bit more, tucking it in further and further each time. I felt like there was too much visibility on the far side. Maybe the model's face was wide, maybe the hair threw me off that drapes over her face, but I felt like I had too much visibility on the far side, even now when I look at it. That texture that I brought in, again, remember how I told you it's micro texture, confuses the eye and changes the eye's focus and direction. So you got to get rid of any excess texture in your brushes, which is great to have inside the positive space, but in the negative space, avoid bringing in any texture in the background or anything like that. So just around here, I bring down the contrast, and I really start to get into getting rid of that plasticky feeling and that overly saturated, like overly hydrated look that can look very, very cheesy and very cheap and plasticky. So what I did was I used the darken layer using the mid-tone, and I just brought that highlight down. And most of the choices that I'm making here are just around focal point, what I want as the focal point, and that's, I'm going to keep those areas intact and untouched. And what I don't want to stand out, especially the far side, the lips, any extra areas that are hidden under cast shadows which don't stand out, those are the areas that I keep under rendered, and that's when I bring in the smudge tool. Now when you bring in the smudge tool, it's not the equivalent of that isn't just getting soft brush and blending away. You're keeping some edges intact and you're blending away others. Yeah, I'm just moving the brush around and blending wherever I feel like I'm being distracted. So I hover my eyes over the focal point, which is the closest eye to us, and then I blend away. And there are some major blends that I do here. Really, really important. I fix some of that issue around the nose in its response to the light source. Always flipping the canvas, of course. But yeah, this is my little journal entry for my latest painting. I don't consider it a full success. I'm very picky and very, I critique myself way more than I critique you guys. But it is a learning experience dealing with this angle and dealing with this level of rendering, and then trying to bring in that really focused, organized sense of blending and random blurring. So bringing some order to the madness, or bringing some disorganization to the disorganization, I guess. And that's really what it is. Everywhere you blend, you're not just blending randomly. You're blending along a set path that guides the eyes around the painting. You're not just blending willy-nilly. You are focusing on a really set trail of detail that guides the eye around the painting and then allows it to hover back in circles, instead of just having detail everywhere. And remember, the most important tip is that a camera sees everything while our eyes see one thing at a time. Everything is periphery vision if we're looking at one thing. And if we're looking at the eyes, the periphery is going to be the mouth and the nose and the further eye. And I wanted the viewer to look at the closest eye, so that's what I ended up detailing and focusing on. And everything else just gets rendered down. So the way I paint, even if I'm using a reference, I'm not following the reference 100%. I'm not allowed to. I'm painting it as if the naked eye has seen this painting, not a camera. And that is, I guess, the end all and be all of how to use references. So those are my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will see you guys next month. Thank you so much for your patronage. You guys rock. Bye.